Okay, so welcome to the UCCHRE book discussion on the human rights imperative in teacher education, developing compassion, understanding, and advocacy, which you have right here. We were just discussing this very cool picture on the front. So we're delighted to have you all here. We have a lot of authors and editors who are going to speak and others who are here to participate. So we welcome you all. And we did have a lot of people registered, so I think more people will be coming in as we begin, but it's great to have you all here, and we'll get started with our speakers. So because we have so many people, I won't read their extensive bios, but I encourage you to go to this link right here. I'm not promoting Amazon, but if you click on the intro to the book and scroll down to the end, you'll see all the bios of all the speakers today and all the authors for the book. We'll begin by hearing from Bill Fernikes, who will introduce the book, and then Gloria Alter will give some remarks and also talk about her contributions as an author of the book. Bill Fernikes and Gloria Alter are the editors for this book. Following that, Felisa Tibbetts and I will give a brief talk on the human rights imperative in teacher education, the chapter 1 of the book, and then Nancy Flowers and Abraham Agenzo will talk about the development and practice of human rights education, historical and global perspectives. Following that, Ada Abiagu will talk about applying human rights education principles in global teacher education, focusing on decolonization and the global South. We also have David Scheinman and Glenn Matoma here. Hello, welcome, who are also authors of the book, and they David is welcoming questions. Glenn may have to leave, so but we're glad he's here for now. And I don't see any other authors, but if you're here and I don't see you, please speak up, and I'm happy to introduce you as well. Oh, Christy Rodelius Palmer, I see Christy's here. She's also on the executive committee of UCCHRE and an author in the book, and is happy to take questions as well. And anyone else? Feel free to speak up because we have multiple pages. Okay, so without further ado, we'll turn it over to Bill Fernikes.
Well, hello, everyone. First, let me thank Sandra Sirota, Christy Rodelius Palmer, and the UCCHRE membership for inviting us to speak with you today. It really is an honor to discuss the book with people who are working hard to advance human rights education every day. My co-editor, Gloria, will discuss aspects of the book's design and contents while highlighting specific chapters that illustrate the unique qualities in the book. But first, let me tell you the origins of this project and its 4-year evolution from concept to finish. As many of you know, I'm a part-time lecturer at the Rutgers Graduate School of Education in New Brunswick, New Jersey, where I've collaborated with Dr. Mary Curran, a friend and colleague who has worked tirelessly to advance global education at Rutgers for many years. She runs the Teaching the World conference annually at Rutgers, and in 2016, she approached me with the idea of having human rights education serve as the conference theme. We assembled 2 panels, one of experienced human rights educators, including some of the people speaking here today, Nancy Flowers, Christy Rodelius Palmer, David Scheinman, and Abraham Agenzo, and another of New Jersey classroom teachers who integrate human rights education into their daily work, and they presented at the conference to great success. A few years later, Mary approached me with the idea of submitting a book proposal for a series on global teacher education, which she and Nilofer Guler of Rockhurst University are editing for Rowman and Littlefield. Since Gloria and I had co-authored a chapter on human rights education for the 2nd edition of the Handbook on Teaching Social Issues, we jointly developed the proposal, submitted it in the fall of 2019. It was accepted by Mary and Nilofer after some revisions, and then we got down to work. Rather than send out a call for chapter proposals, Gloria and I decided to invite authors who had considerable experience in both human rights education and higher education as contributors. The contributor list for the book reflects scholars who have published widely in human rights education and related fields, and others who leverage experience from pre-collegiate teaching and work with NGOs in their chapters. He also made a commitment to engaging an international set of authors from the global North and global South, while inviting them to explore connections between human rights education and other fields of inquiry, for example, global citizenship education and the rights of children. In December 2020, Roman and Littlefield agreed to move forward with our book as part of the Global Teacher Education series. And after 2 more years of work, the final product was published in 3 formats in fall 2020. Hardback, I should say fall 2021, or excuse me, 22, thank you. Hardback, paperback, and ebook. Speaking for myself, it has been a great pleasure working with Gloria, who is the best co-editor one could have on a project of this complexity, as well as with our team of outstanding authors. I look forward to their presentations today and the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Bill. So we'll turn it over to Gloria Alter. And I should say, if you have questions or comments, please, if you can keep them till the end, and then we'll ask people, we'll call on people as you raise your hands, and we'll take questions and have a discussion. Thank you. So Gloria.
Thanks. Thanks for the opportunity to be here. And Bill, thank you for your remarks. Overall, our book addresses human rights education and how it can transform teacher education and education more broadly. The foreword, the first half of the introduction, and chapter 1 provide an orientation to human rights education, its history, current status, and relationship to schooling. Chapter 9, authored by Matoma and Sirota, provides our conclusion by sharing lessons from the chapters and implications for teacher education by synthesizing helpful themes. Chapter 2, authored by Flowers and Magenzo, provides an extensive historical and global overview of HRE, bringing decades of experience to this task and doing it admirably. The chapter is a standalone history usable in teacher ed or other contexts. Chapter 3, authored by Osler and Starkey, reviews the development of and interconnections between citizenship/democratic education, global education, and human rights education. Its discussion is grounded in substantive theory and practice at the national and global levels. Their chapter is characterized by an intriguing style of writing that presents an initial concept and gently adds layers of complexity to it without confrontation or othering. This approach opens the reader's mind to many rich and complex understandings, as it acknowledges the limits of certain normalized, quote, democratic practices. Chapter 4, authored by Obiagu, highlights the importance of decolonizing global teacher education through human rights education. She broadens our perspectives and provides examples of school-based HRE practices in the global South. Chapter 5, authored by Koval and Howe, discusses rights-based education for children as delineated in the Convention on the Rights of the Child. I refer to the 3 Ps: protection, provision, and participation. It further applies these rights in several areas: rights to an education, a certain kind of education, with equality and for the full development of the child. Rights in education are discussed, whereas students still have their rights in school, such as the right not to be discriminated against. And third, rights through education, learning about their rights. Children's rights provide a strong foundation and rationale for addressing many of the challenges of schooling, especially where children are vulnerable, such as children with disabilities, LGBTQ+ children, migrant children, and ethnic minorities, etc. Koval and Howe describe, and I mentioned it on that it's on page 121 forward, this wonderful initiative, Rights, Respect, and Responsibility. It successfully developed a supportive school culture using the Convention on the Rights of the Child as the basis for all school policies and practices. It began in the early grades and expanded through secondary education, lasting for over 10 years. Teacher burnout was reduced, student participation was enhanced, and student behavior improved. Excuse me. Chapters 6 through 8 describe applications of HRE at the elementary, middle, and secondary grade levels. They incorporate human rights documents and related resources and describe unit examples that address critical current human rights issues. Another topic I want to give attention to is transforming teacher education. On pages 6 to 9 of the introduction, a simple conceptual redesign for curricular transformation is described, involving core areas of teacher ed programs, foundations, methods, and applications to field experience and other contexts. Details describe how foundations courses can be revised to incorporate HRE themes and values to add depth to what is traditionally covered, and ideas to develop human rights-centered methods courses, fieldwork, and other experiences are described in a way that they can be easily implemented. Other program components are also discussed. An example of a conceptual framework for a human rights integrated teacher ed program is the transformational human rights educator. Its rationale and theoretical basis is described. Also, examples of teacher standards or competencies, including dispositions applicable to global and human rights infused programs, are suggested. Critical global perspectives in multiple fields of education support this process, and implications for the integration of HRE and teacher ed are found throughout the book. Chapter 10 provides substantive visions within which to contextualize HRE activities, goals, and guidelines for teachers to implement HRE and teacher ed, and numerous activities that can be used with this book. Chapter 6 addresses a wide variety of data on the status and well-being of LGBTQ people, including youth, and the consequences of discrimination and violence in their lives. It discusses LGBTQ education and teacher education, providing instructional guidelines and extensive resources. U.S. and international survey data reveals that LGBTQ+ students are frequently endangered. Teacher education for LGBTQ rights is lacking internationally as well as in the U.S. LGBTQ+ human rights documents, statements, and reports reveal the extensive nature of UN regional and national international countries' support for LGBTQ+ human rights. Challenges and obstacles to LGBTQ+ rights are found to be the strongest in certain UN states and demographic groups in geographic areas of the U.S. The overlapping human rights education and LGBTQ+ literature addresses what LGBTQ+ rights education is needed. Numerous publications and resources providing successful strategies for advocacy, narratives that compel compassion, and educational tools that promote understanding. These publications are noted in this chapter, and specific applications and resources include an LGBTQ+ human rights centered scope and sequence for K-6 plus middle school. Teacher education program objectives that I found to be especially helpful for LGBTQ+ human rights integration. Practical ideas for teachers who face obstacles to LGBTQ+ instruction, and unit examples and a variety of educational resources that can inspire unlearning cultural assumptions and promote inclusion. And I just wanted to say that I recently had the opportunity to speak with colleagues at AERA and AACTE who are enthusiastic about receiving copies of our book because they can use it in their development of teacher education, and also international educators in particular, because of the serious human rights challenges their countries are facing and the censorship that they face in teaching. Thanks for the opportunity to share.
Thank you, Gloria. So now we'll turn it over to Felisa.
Sure, and thanks to the editors, both Gloria and Bill, for inviting Sandra and myself to develop what turns out to be a fairly short chapter, actually linked closely with the title of the book, the imperative basically for teacher education to include human rights. So what I want to do briefly, Sandra and I both will be sharing, is just highlight some of the points in our chapter, because those of us who have been involved in human rights education in schools are already familiar, I think, with some of the opportunities, the challenges, and the landscape of trying to organize effective human rights education in a teacher training, whether it's happening pre-service or in service. So one of our points in our chapter was that there is essentially a mandate, or an imperative, if you will, to have human rights education and teacher education, because we have seen in the last since the 1990s and documented as of 10 years ago, an increased presence of human rights in national curriculum. So a study carried out by Russell and Suarez, and the data was collected about 10 years ago, showed more than 83 countries across different regions having human rights somehow in their national curriculum. And studies of textbooks have also shown an increase in the number of times that human rights is mentioned. Now, this doesn't speak to how in-depth these references to human rights are, but nevertheless, it opens doors for human rights to be addressed in the classroom, and again, helps to provide an imperative for teacher education to include human rights, certainly in these countries where it's in the national curriculum, but hopefully not exclusively. We also know, those of us who've worked with teachers, that we have found human rights showing up in different ways in curriculum. It's not always embedded inside of a subject such as citizenship education or history education. Sometimes it's transversal in terms of human rights norms like equality, participation, non-discrimination. And one could make, and across different levels of schooling. So one can make the argument also that human rights education is necessary for teachers across subject matters and at different levels as well. So it's not just one particular kind of teacher, for example, a teacher teaching social studies who learns about human rights. Of course, we who are human rights educators would assert that human rights education should happen with all teachers, because it has to also do with the responsibilities as duty bearers, fulfilling the right to education for learners, but pragmatically also and instrumentally, certainly in those national contexts or local contexts where human rights is part of the national curriculum. Teacher education around human rights, again, this is just a review, can take place, I guess, pre-service, in-service, and also carried out by different kinds of organizations. I think many of us here in this room today, this Zoom room, are likely associated with non-governmental organizations. And oftentimes it is NGOs working with teachers, especially in service, that are introducing teachers sometimes for the first time to human rights in some depth, and also with some critical frameworks. But it's also possible, and those of us in the UCCHRE are, of course, endorsing that higher education institutions, especially public ones associated with governments, take on their responsibilities to introduce human rights education as called for by the World Program for Human Rights Education, and now most recently SDG 4.7 and the Declaration on Human Rights Education and Training. So there's a push, of course, there's more than there used to be, but we're still pushing to get more human rights education happening in higher education and teacher education. One of the missions of the book to highlight how that might happen, what that might look like. But there are other institutions and organizations also involved in HRE that have a lot to offer also in terms of experience and methodologies that work well with teachers. My final point is that before I turn it over to Sandra, again, thinking about the landscape for the imperative of human rights in teacher education, is that there's so many considerations once we, at the teacher level, about how to adapt, to localize, to implement what's intended curriculum for human rights with their own learner group. So those of us who are educators, we know there's so many decisions that need to be taken about how we might adapt materials based on the age of our learners, their maturity level. In the terms of human rights education, it would also be in reference to maybe their prior exposure to human rights. And a study that I took part in a few years ago, just about 5 years ago, with colleagues in South Africa and in India and in Sweden. We looked in just a few classrooms to see what kinds of human rights topics were being brought up by students in their own learning. What did they remember learning about human rights? And what we found across these 4 countries in our small sample of classrooms was that there was a kind of, happily, a balance, a treatment of human rights related to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights that included civil, political, social, economic, cultural rights. But then within individual countries in this study, we saw more emphasis on certain kinds of rights, not surprising. So in the US, more of an emphasis on freedom of expression, civil and political rights. In South Africa, rights related to basic needs like right to housing and so forth. So the political context in which schooling takes place, the political context around human rights, around democracy, this is also a consideration for teachers and how to navigate that so HRE is relevant for their learners, and teachers being capacitated to make those judgments and given agency to do so, a very important part of teacher education. Sandra?
Thanks, Felisa. So I'm going to talk a little bit about some challenges and then offer an example of a program that addresses some of the issues that Felisa spoke about. So we note that a key challenge for human rights education within the schooling sector, less so for the non-formal education sector, is how to empower learners to take action for human rights. And so it's challenging, one, because educational authorities and individual teachers may not feel comfortable with an agenda of human rights education to activate, to teach their students to take action for human rights. Human rights education is seen as political education rather than critical active citizenship at times, and there can be a reluctance to link human rights with contemporary challenges in society. So this relegates learning of human rights to history. Another challenge is the pedagogy itself that might be used by educators. And so as we consider teacher preparation for human rights education, we need to think about both content, skills, and pedagogy. Transformative human rights education is a model described by Monisha Bajaj in her 2018 paper. And it offers a model for fostering a transformative experience for learners that allows them to engage in human rights action and sustain that engagement over time in different contexts and in coalition with others. So at the University of Connecticut, we have a program called Human Rights Close to Home. It's a new pilot program designed by Glenn Matoma that we're implementing coming this year for the first year. And we're working with 25 teachers in Connecticut across all grades and subjects over 2 years to integrate human rights education into their curriculum. We'll be working this year with 15 students and going forward 25 students per year. These will be high school students who will join a summer institute along with teachers starting this summer, and then engage in civic engagement projects that they will implement throughout the school year with support from mentors at the University of Connecticut. The teachers will come to the Summer Institute. They will learn human rights content, skills, pedagogy, and then they will go back to their schools for the year and implement human rights education in their subjects, in their grade levels. They'll get support from Human Rights Close to Home faculty and staff throughout the year. They'll come back the next summer and revise their curriculum in order to develop lessons or a unit that they can share open access for all teachers. And I'm happy to answer any questions about the program during the Q&A. So that gives you one example of a program that we're working to address some of the challenges and to provide a transformative experience in human rights education. So now we'll turn it over to Nancy Flowers. I believe you're next.
Thank you. I'm sorry to say I had an email this morning from Abraham that just said simply I can't come or can't attend. But fortunately, I have what he was going to say. So I'm going to first speak in his voice to you. This is Abraham Magensu from Chile. Let me first thank Gloria and Bill for giving Nancy and me the opportunity to write an article in your book. And this is what he said. Working with Nancy was an intellectual and above all emotional experience. We strengthened our longstanding friendship and mutual affection. And I can say very much the same for me. From our article, with a look to the future, here are some of the critical factors that must be considered for an appropriate development in the future for human rights education. Number one, training educators. There's an urgent need worldwide to train more human rights educators at every level, elementary through university, as well as popular education. Furthering research. Although human rights education is a field open to all discipline, currently very little research is being undertaken. The need, however, is great, especially regarding the results achieved by human rights education, the old evaluation question. And finally, maintaining integrity. How can human rights education maintain a commitment to education, not only about, but also through and for human rights? So that was, fortunately, he had sent me his words. So those are, I'm going to, now this is me. And I'll just say that in the first place, I was really flattered when Bill and Gloria approached Abraham and me about contributing to this book, and delighted at the prospect of working with my old compadre, Abraham. And frankly, I thought writing about historical and global perspectives would be the proverbial piece of cake for us. After all, as elders in the field, Abraham and I had been eyewitness to much of that early development and practice. Our first draft was a romp. We had so much fun, remembering those pioneer days when we were all exploring what human rights education could and should be. However, with great tact, Bill and Gloria pointed out that our perspective had stopped somewhere around the turn of the 21st century, omitting important developments in both scholarship and practice. This project thus became a huge learning experience, actually, for both of us. It was a challenge to integrate what we knew from the past and to really understand where the future might be and gain a much more broad and inclusive perspective on our field. I came away from this project with some new insights, particularly with joy, an appreciation of the creative potential for human rights education. There's no single way to do this. Every context requires the educator to develop a learning that fits the circumstances and concerns of the learners. We know this, but observing how people had taken this and the creativity with which they had adapted human rights education to human rights needs was wonderful. They were ingenious, inspiring, and proof positive to me of the potential for human rights education for social change. Secondly, for me, it was the importance of sharing these innovative responses to educational needs. In our article, we used examples of how the Latin American experience directly influenced the experience in the Philippines. And we believe that the Philippines directly influenced experiences in South Africa. And that's why networks like this very one, and also Human Rights Educators USA and others in other parts of the world are so vital to the progress of our field. Also, the two international journals we now have, we need to keep learning from each other. And I have to say, when I look at who's here today, representing Africa, Europe, India, and South America, it's wonderful. This is exactly what we should be doing, learning from each other and then adapting it to the needs of our particular situation. Finally, I really came to see, given the local and national and international political climate, how important human rights education is to the increasing nationalism and authoritarianism and threats to democracy that we're all facing in one way or another. I think human rights education has a huge contribution to make. And finally, I just want to say that I really think this book is tremendously important for teacher education. You can't teach a class, even if you wanted to, without a textbook. And most teachers go at it by patching together. Bill and Gloria have given us something that's a resource for our own collective efforts to increase human rights education and make it part. I hope someday, one of my dreams is that you can't get a teacher's certificate without having had a course, at least one course in human rights. Teachers above all should know about the rights of the children. So thank you.
Thank you, Nancy. And we'll turn it over to Ada.
Thank you for having me. Greetings wherever you are coming from. And to Bill and Gloria, thank you so much for inviting me to contribute a chapter in your book. To Sandra, thanks for organizing this program. So my chapter explored how to draw on human rights education principles to improve global teacher education. It explored existing literature on global teacher education and human rights, and it found out that human rights contents and global issues are emphasized in different programs, be it science or arts or humanities. Contents like climate change, inequalities, human rights, gender, feminism, racism, ethnocentrism, all these are emphasized in many teacher education programs across the globe, across the world, both the global north and the global south. And then he began to wonder, the paper wondered why in the midst of those global contents or issues emphasized across teacher education programs and also secondary education programs, why there is inconsistency between these contents and also the observable global citizenship behaviors like empathy, kindness, and tolerance, which is also observable in the rising cases of xenophobic attacks, ethnocentric attacks, racism, anti-feminism, and other global issues. So it explored literature further to see what educational researchers have found. And it showed that there is a problem with the way these contents are implemented. That teacher education programs emphasizing these global contents approach it from a neoliberal perspective and also from capitalist perspective, in the sense that the economic gains emanating from education are more emphasized, and the employability is also emphasized. So the affective domain or goals of education that are key to global education are actually underemphasized. And then the problem is because knowledges are a kind of universalized from the Western perspective. So from this angle, the paper argued for an anti-colonial approach to human rights contents and global contexts, and it locates human rights education principles as useful for this shift from dominant neoliberal perspectives to pluriversal perspectives, recognizing that human rights education and global issues could be solved from different approaches. For example, in the global south, especially the African context, human rights could be attained through communalism that emphasizes collective social belonging or interaction, other than individualism, which is usually emphasized in the North, where people are expected to be independent from one another. So interdependence is really important for attaining human rights in the global South. So it emphasized that for the goals of global education, such as promoting social coexistence, peaceful coexistence, social cohesion, holistic human development, and active citizenship engagement, then there is need to draw on human rights education principles, such as its pedagogies and its ecology in global teacher education. By pedagogies, looking at methods or pedagogies such as transformative methods, critical methods that question the dominant methods existing in the field. Then for ecology, it emphasizes the need for global teacher education practices and curriculum to consider the context of human rights education and the norms. He gave instances of locations or countries such as South Africa, India, where the cultural norms of the states were actually integrated into human rights education. For example, Rachel Wow's work showed that in India, people were more interested in human rights when their culture is actually infused in human rights education, when their culture is related to human rights education, when it is presented from within their context instead of presenting it as contents that are distant from who they are. So from that perspective, the paper argues for this anti-colonial approach that emphasizes pro-reversal perspectives, considers the norms of countries or contexts where the global issues are being emphasized. It also calls for the need to actually shift focus on the places emphasized in existing literature as the places for global issues, because it was found that most global teacher education programs or contests emphasize the global south as places for global issues, while the north are the saviors. So it calls for educators to center the roles or the contributions of multinational organizations that are based on the global north to global issues in the global south. By so doing, students in the global north could be encouraged to participate in solving issues in the global south. Thank you for listening.
Thank you so much. So I'm going to stop recording here.